I'm going to get two microphones because I'm going to just put you on the spot, sorry. I said Julian and Sue, and of course they're known to many of us, but not all of us. And I also know that you're not only well versed in theatre. We have this thing in theatre called theatre sports, don't we, where you do improvisation right at the last minute. So I'm going to take the liberty of asking you if, on no notice at all, I were to ask you to recall a memory from childhood about church. Anyone at all, just one that strikes you. It could be good, or it could in fact be otherwise. If I were to throw that at you, how would you respond to that? Who wants to go first?
Sue does.
Here's a microphone, so you can give it to him for that. Where did you grow up? What was church like for you in the beginning?
I grew up in Lincolnshire, and I went to a church.
Just a bit closer to it. There we go. Yeah.
And I went to a church school, and the vicar came in every week and taught us prayers and asked us, "Who are you? Who gave you your name?" and things like that. And we went through all the baptismal stuff.
Yeah. Memorizing it.
Memorizing it. Oh
yeah.
yeah, of course. Yeah. We didn't understand a lot of what we were saying.
What was your emotional experience with that? How did it feel?
Very authoritarian.
Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That is, and thank you, that is the perfect thing to talk about, is that in our past, we've often, a lot of us, had that sense that religion was an authoritarian structure and basically a negative experience. And that somehow there was a treasure hidden inside of that. There's the hidden diamond that's surrounded by all the roughness of structure. Is that fair? That's my experience.
Yeah. The image of Jesus was the soft part of it.
Yeah.
God was a bit fearful.
Yeah. Very good, thanks. All right, Julian, I'm just going to throw this at you. Where did you grow up in terms of church? Was it Anglican or otherwise?
No, I grew up. I didn't grow up.
Never grown up. Yes, me neither. You were dragged up where?
In Nottingham.
Yeah.
In Nottingham, and my first experience of religion, if you like, was at school. When we went to school at age 4 or 5, and we had morning prayers. Mm-hmm. That was our introduction. But my first introduction to church, if you like, was a boys' group called the Crusaders. Mm. And the Crusaders was, how can I put it? It was very evangelical. Mm-hmm. Really evangelical. Only boys. And it came out of the public school system, which is really private. Mm. So it's very, and I've spent a lifetime shedding it.
Right. So here's the same thing then. We're talking about that same, if I were to describe the emotional quality attached to those early experiences.
Well, having said that, it was extremely supportive.
Yes.
To me in my childhood, from the age of, I should think, 8 to 18. Extremely supportive. It gave me a foundation, and it's only in looking back and recognizing that the truths that I had been taught to accept were perhaps not truths.
Yeah.
And having to deal with that, that's been a big part of my religious experience.
Wonderful.
That
sounds fantastic, Julian. Now, first of all, thank you. Can we give them a little applause? I give no warning or notice. So, and the good thing is, if you want to, you can tell more stories of your own. You've got the floor in a couple of weeks. But yes, the idea that I don't know what's true of your experience of church, but for many of us who grew up with it, it was indeed that supportive environment in some cases, where Jesus was the heart and center of what was comforting, and the vicar wasn't so much necessarily, because the fiercely rigid people that we ran across in church, whether they were clergy or otherwise, were sometimes a part of that same experience. So I don't know about you, but it's that mixture of, if you like, negative emotions and positive emotions, as we so call them. In fact, in our Hosea reading, we hear God described in these terms of the roaring lion and the angry one, seeing something wrong and getting anger. And actually, anger is we talk about it as a negative emotion, but if it helps us to set a boundary for that which is wrong and unjust, it allows us to deal with it. In the past, whatever we had to face, we've seen Pope Francis making apologies for, and finally he used the word genocide this week, for the treatment given by members of the church, and indeed structures of the church, cooperating with the federal government in creating harm. And he described two emotions, indignation and shame, because those are both intensely appropriate responses to something that is profoundly wrong. And Hosea, the prophet, describes that as being a divine thing too. That God also experiences this immense anger in seeing something wrong. And then, just to take your part, Sue, about, Jesus was the softness in the middle of the hard outer core, or the shining diamond hiding behind the carbon. That in Hosea's vision, it's the compassion that actually is the final driving force. So the anger and indignation set the boundary of what is acceptable, and the love and the compassion determine the final outcome. We saw two other things, I think, in Jesus' parable. In the Origins, our gospel story today, talks about the way in which someone pops up out of the crowd and says, I'm having a dispute with my brother over my parents' inheritance. There's money at stake. Could you just tell him to share it properly with me? And Jesus could have said, yeah, that's unfair. I'm the rabbi, I'll make a decision. But instead, he actually starts to dig a bit deeper into what is actually the motivation behind our question. Is it justice, or is it something else? And he puts his finger on greed. And he asks instead how we define our lives and the scale of values in our life. So let me put it this way. Here's your sermon for today in a nutshell. It's the quality and quantity of our consciousness, expressed as love and compassion in action, that is the wealth of our life, not the quality and quantity of our possessions. Jesus preaches the kingdom of God. In our contemporary secular world and psychological language, we might say that represents the purity of consciousness expressing love and compassion. It divides between the ethic of purity, which is all about getting it right and excluding all the people that we don't think are right, and the ethic of compassion, which is about sharing generously what we have. And these two forces are in competition in our world. In fact, in a world of climate crisis, whether we live with greed or generosity shapes everything, absolutely everything, in terms of the outcome. The Industrial Revolution set in motion many things. The creation of business and companies and products and profits and all of these wonderful things that, if you like, enhance our life because of people's technical skills. We're glad that we have refrigerators and cars and so forth at one level. Because yes, of course, we need to keep our food and store it, and we need to transport ourselves around and all of these things. But one of the tragic hidden consequences is that these things didn't just become benign or equally shared, but they tended to form, as profits maximize, they tend to end up in smaller and smaller amounts of power and control, and they accumulate in certain areas. And so we have that parable of Jesus about the wealthy person saying, you know, this is great. Let's just build more and more barns to hold more and more stuff, and then we can really put our feet up and just relax and enjoy. And instead, Jesus says, well, supposing you had died last night. Really, what would it count for? Where would it all belong? And he again puts his finger on that greed impulse. One of the outcomes, again, of our industrial revolution is that we have started to heat up the planet because we produce more and more goods that emit carbon. And as we do so, these greenhouse gases lead us to a place now of, if I may use the words of Bill McGuire, who is a retired climate expert and volcanologist, he studies volcanoes. His latest book is called Hot House Earth. That's what we've come to. And just, I don't know how your week has been, but it's been pretty hot house earth for me this week. And we are just, last summer's heat dome and this week's excessive heat and humidity is reminding us, it's putting in our face the wildfires throughout this continent, the floods, that our climate is going beyond a level that we can easily recover. Indeed, we may not be able, we will never see it for those of us now in our, shall we say, mature years. We will never see a climate that is like the one that we experienced as children. And our children and grandchildren will have no choice but to adapt, if they can, to what they inherit from us. Because the structures of our society and the greed that has come along with it have meant that we go on doing what is unsustainable for our future, whilst trying to reap the benefits for ourselves. We call that greed. And it is costing us our planet, and not less than that. It's devastating. Bill McGuire outlines at least 4 or 5 levels of crisis, which we can see. And I think when you feel the intensity of the heat this week, it helps focus your imagination. First of all, as the glaciers melt, there's a lot of the rock crust of the earth that has been held in place by ice. And so earthquakes and tsunamis will start to increase in number and cause the kind of devastation that the big tsunami of 2004 did, for example, or the one in Fukushima 10 years ago in Tokyo. The second thing is that as the polar caps melt with the increase of heat, methane will be released. And methane is even more destructive than carbon in terms of increasing the heat of our planet. So we will get even more devastating levels of heat and floods coming from that source. This is a cheery sermon today, isn't it? But he says if you don't say this, it's all climate appeasement. If you keep on saying, oh yes, but we have time, then you'll do nothing. So you have to look the harshness of human greed in the face and see what the consequences are of our choice between greed and generosity, which will be shaped by what is in our heart, every one of us, as resources become scarce in this world. Right now, there is a severe water shortage affecting India, Pakistan, and China, who are then in theoretical competition for a scarce resource. These are the biggest populations on the planet. Nuclear capable. It's the perfect breeding ground for populist governments to promise the earth in order to gain power and control of scarce resources. 1958 years ago, in the month of July, in the city of Rome, there occurred a great fire. We all know the phrase, fiddling while Rome burns, don't we? Yeah. The Emperor Nero was the ultimate in tyrannical and populist-style leaders. And the story goes is that he wasn't interested in working through the Senate and the law structures of Rome to have his way, so he would bypass them all by trying to buy off the population with games and fun. And then just had his own little plan to burn the city down so that he could rebuild it in his own image. And of course, he, in order to avoid any blame for this lunatic approach to politics and society, he looked for a scapegoat. And he found in this small but growing visible minority called the Christians in Rome someone he could blame. There's nothing like having a small visible minority if you're a populist leader seeking to gain control than to blame and scapegoat and focus all the attention on these smaller groups who are numerically defenseless. And so Nero played his fiddle and sang his songs, rejoicing in the burning of his city so that it could become his in a new way. Isn't it terrifying that in the human heart, when greed runs rampant, the greed for power and control, the vision of scarcity rather than abundance leads us to make decisions that focus on our own short-term interests, our own power and the well-being of the few over the generous sharing to the many. That was a literal fire, but it's our planet in Rome. It was buildings that burned down. That lasted maybe a few weeks. We have a planet that's on fire. You can feel it. You are at risk of heat stroke if you're not careful this past week. Species are wiped out. Crops do not grow well. 80% of the world's population depends on 10 crops that are cereal-based, wheat and rice and all of these types of things. They do not thrive well in excessive heat, and they cannot grow without sufficient water. These are the results of human choices. These are the results of greed in action. We need to listen to the voices of the prophets, the voices of wisdom and love and compassion. We need to harness our anger at injustice and allow generosity and compassion to be the guides of how we expend our energy as a species. We have immense power to do good. We have immense power to do harm. Our life consists not in the quality and quantity of our possessions, but the quality and quantity of our consciousness and our practice of generous sharing, love,